So what was the plan that Governor Gage devised to to conduct this powder raid to Concord? Because from my understanding, Concord was pretty far away from Boston. This was sort of the furthest powder raid they were conducting. It was a pretty big operation for the circumstances. So, what exactly is his plan? I know obviously a big element of that is surprise.
Yes, yes, of course. It goes to Gage's plan was evolved from the last one that had happened. That was the raid on Salem that had been unsuccessful, or near Salem. I'm trying to remember the name of the town now. But they had gone by sea. A ship had taken a regiment, the 60, I believe, is the 64th Regiment, uh, to this island. And one of the reasons Gage was worried about the bridges at Concord is because the colonists had raised the drawbridge and didn't allow the British soldiers to get to where they were storing their weapons until they had spirited them away, and then so the British went home empty-handed. So what Gage wanted them to do was get to Concord before the Americans were alarmed, because he knew there was some sort of alarm system, but he didn't think it was sophisticated enough to oppose his raiding party. He picked at that time, the British Army was organized and had 10 companies. Each regiment was the basic unit. Each regiment had 10 companies, include 8 regular line companies, and then a grenadier company, which was supposed to be taller, stronger guys, and then a light infantry company was supposed to be quicker, faster guys. And so what he did was gather all the what they call flanker companies, and put them in 2 battalions: a grenadier battalion and a light infantry battalion. And so that he would have the elite of the British Army in Boston would go on this raid, march overnight, destroy the arms, and then return back. A couple of flaws in the plan. What they did have some officers go and recon the route beforehand, but they didn't. The British Army did not have a good feeling. They had rarely been outside of Boston since the troubles had started, and they didn't have a good grasp on what was going on. Obviously, the colonists did, and then they didn't understand the alarm system. They didn't know how many for sure were going to go on. They didn't know. One of the big faults they didn't know was that one of the places that when the alarm went out, where all the American militia regiments were supposed to meet, was Concord, which is right. So they were going right into the mouth of the enemy. So the plan, and then he kept it a secret from everybody, clear up until literally the night before. What happens is everybody knew about it except the British soldiers that were trying to execute the plan. It was a big problem for them, and that's one of the things I found so fascinating about the story is these guys, they were told at 8 o'clock in the evening, "Hey, you got to march to Concord tonight and destroy all the arms and march back before the American militia, which is 4 times as big as you, is going to come out and before their turnout, as they say." So, yeah, that was the plan: march there, destroy the arms, and march back before the Americans can come out.
Yeah, speaking of that drawbridge you mentioned, it was an interesting little anecdote from the novel. One of the guys who was at that raid, that unsuccessful raid, he mentioned kind of offhand that if it wasn't for this drawbridge, the revolution would have started there. Because the only reason the British weren't able to pursue this plan was because they got quelled by this drawbridge. But if that was down, there probably would have been an armed conflict there. But yeah, this operation seems to have been very poorly planned. They didn't alert them until late at night that they're marching to Concord. A lot of the guys were drinking. I don't know if that was just a dramatization for the novel, but a lot of them are drunk in bed and they have to get awoken. I mean, you can imagine how miserable that would be if you're sort of half drunk, half hungover, and you have to march 20 miles to Concord to do this powder raid.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. One they do that, I don't know. Have you been to Boston before on Patriot Day? Well, on Patriot Day, it's a celebration of the raid on Concord, and the start of the Revolutionary War, and that's the Boston Marathon too at the same time, and so it's kind of significant that, because for the British that was more than a marathon. They had to go 17 miles each way, carrying muskets and all their accoutrements. So it was very strenuous marching. And having marched overnight before, I can tell you it gets rough after a while.
Yeah, that was probably miserable. But these guys, they cross the river, they're marching towards Concord, but the first confrontation comes at Lexington. The militia is alerted. They turn out, as you would say, and there's this small force at Lexington led by Captain John Parker. And one of the infamous quotes in American history. John Parker says, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." So, what exactly is sort of the scene of confrontation at Lexington? The shot heard around the world that sparks the revolution, turns the world upside down.
Right. Well, and I don't know what method that they found out, but a lot of the Patriot leaders before the raid on Concord, one found out about the raid, but they also found out about the orders coming from Parliament telling Governor Gage to arrest the Patriot leaders. So most of the Patriot leaders, other than Joseph Warren and one other guy, his last name was Church, I can't think of his name now, had already left Boston. And interestingly enough, John Hancock, the famous John Hancock on the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, his house was in Lexington. His family home. He was from Lexington. His family home was there, and he went there, and I believe it was John Adams is also there with him. So when the raiders are marching toward Lexington, most of the Lexington militia and the Lexington militia leaders thought that one of the things they're trying to do is capture John Hancock and John Adams in Lexington. So they called out the militia, and they were standing by to make a demonstration. And then Paul Revere actually helped load some of John Hancock's stuff into a wagon so they could move it out and they could flee. And so did Jonas Clark, who was the minister there and who was living in John Hancock's house. They all helped move Hancock and Adams to flee before the British soldiers showed up. So what the American militia was doing was being an army of observation, which is what the provincial Congress had told them to do, is be an army of observation and view and not so much block it, but if they be prepared to fight if they attack people or destroy property. I think was the order, but not to attack them just because the war had not started.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't want armed conflict. They were just there to kind of repel the British.
Not even repel the British. They were just going to deter the British from doing anything. Mm.
Right. So John Adams and John Hancock were actually in Lexington kind of the night of the raid, and they were alerted as part of that spy ring.
That's right, and they left. They fled because the troops were coming.
Wow, that's interesting. So if it wasn't for this speedy communication and spy ring, we might have had a very different history, huh?
Yes, right. If it wasn't for that communication system, which Paul Revere was part of, and so was Joseph Warren, so was the other many other gentlemen that went out across the Massachusetts, and it was happening in other states too. Other states had set up the same kind of alarm systems to notify the militia so that they could go out.
Wow, that's fascinating. So who fired the shot heard around the world? Do we know?
Well, it depends on how you know who fired the first shot in Lexington. To me, this nobody knows for sure because both sides. By the way, this is interesting. There was no unit historians back in those days, and there was nobody marching with the British, and there was no historians with the Americans. And both sides, after the battle, wrote letters to the king explaining what had happened in their own view. And both of them blamed, of course, the Americans blamed the British, blamed the regulars, and the regulars blamed uh, the American militia. It was most likely, though, that the Americans in Lexington were kind of scattered about when the British showed up. There was only I believe the Lexington militia was only like about 140, 150 guys. and only about 70 of them were still standing on the green when the British marched in, and they had just formed up. And there were some of them, as I describe it in the book, many of them were still running up from their homes or wherever they had been spending the night. And it is believed that several of these guys that were running up misunderstood what was going on and shot at the British soldiers because that they thought the fighting had already started. So if you go with that, my personal assessment is that Americans probably fired the first shot at Lexington. However, Concord is the opposite. The British actually admitted that at Concord Bridge, the first shot that was fired by not by orders, but by a soldier who got over anxious when they were watching the militia march down on them when they were guarding Concord Bridge.
Yeah, that's an important aspect to this whole thing is the aspect of discipline, firing discipline. Um, a lot of these guys sort of, as soon as the conflict erupted, they lost all sorts of discipline and just kind of scattered and shot randomly, huh?
Right, exactly. Especially the American militia. That's a big problem with militias. My dad told me the story. He was in this General Staff College with an African officer, and the African officer said he was at some he was at some place. They were moving. They were marching toward the Capitol, and a whole bunch of people came out. It was a real popular deal, and a whole bunch of militia were marching along with the army. And they heard a shot. And he went forward to recon what was going on, and all the militia had gone when he got back. They just disappeared once a shot was fired, and that unfortunately is a big problem. Militia don't understand. It's not that they won't. It's just they're not. They don't have the internal discipline and unit confidence to stand up. Especially in those days where you got to stand there and take a bullet, really, literally, or at least the guy next to you take a bullet. So yeah, it was a big problem with the militia.
Yeah, exactly. And these are just regular townspeople who kind of showed up, heeded the call of duty. This isn't a professional army. They have very minimal training. So as soon as shots start firing, they kind of shoot one volley and run away. Which do you think if there would have been more discipline among the militia and they kind of would have stood their ground for a second volley, maybe a third volley, do you think that this British force could have been defeated right then and there?
Not at Lexington because there wasn't enough people available. At Concord, it's possible that um, they could have gathered, or it could have gathered enough soldiers along the way, but there wasn't a plan, right? There was no organization. They didn't have the communications set up. They didn't have a command structure. And I believe I say in the novel, an army without communications is just a mob, and they didn't have that setup. They knew that they needed drums and they knew they needed flags because that's how they organized in those days. But they were not organized on that day, April 19th, 1775. They were not organized on that day. They were trying to get that way, but they weren't. In fact, it took probably again, it wasn't probably until um, later in the war that they had enough organization to fight the British one on one and defeat them.
Exactly. And it seems to me that the opportunity really presented itself here. If there would have been that level of organization and discipline, they could have sort of defeated this force right then and there. Because a big aspect was that the British were short on powder and shot. They were prioritizing rapid movement. They wanted their march to be fast and speedy, so they traveled light, and they didn't really necessarily have the munitions to kind of conduct a big battle.
Right. No, exactly. They wanted to. The intent was to get in, raid, destroy the arms, and get back. So they had to march only with the one issue of ammo, one issue of rations for a day, and they weren't prepared to stand and make a big fight. On the other hand, I should mention this: George Washington lamented the fact that the militia were I think he referred to depending on the militia as depending on a broken stick. He throughout the war he was trying to develop a professional army that he could depend on in war. But some American generals, though, later in the war, actually used the militia quite effectively. um, and in that they would use them to kind of tire out the British, and then by the time they got to the Continental Army, they had already been exhausted or confused by what was going on, and then they would fight the real soldiers that that were engaged in the battle.
Yeah, later on, the militia have a huge impact, especially at the Battle of Saratoga. Towards the final battles of Saratoga, the militia numbers
It was all militia
swelled.
there, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. And it was like, I think by the end, the Battle of Bemis Heights, it was like a 3-to-1 ratio.
Right. It was just overwhelmed, and that would have been that was kind of the fear, as I mentioned, but from my what the British officers were experiencing. They were afraid that they were going to be overwhelmed. That if the Americans could gather enough, they would be overwhelmed. And in fact, I think the Lord again, or Earl Hugh Percy, at the end of the battle said that, yeah, if I hadn't turned left at this one stage and gone north, I might have been overwhelmed on my way back to Boston. So that was his own testimony, not a historian's testimony.
Wow. So there's this small skirmish at Lexington. Couple dead, couple wounded. The first blood is shed. Well, not really. I think the first blood of the revolution is shed at the Boston Massacre. I think you can make that argument. But nevertheless, the first bloodshed of the actual war is shed here at Lexington. The British carry on and continue on their mission to Concord despite this skirmish. So Concord seems to be the larger of the battle. What happens when they reach Concord?
Well, they get there. Again, we the Americans were already alerted to that the regulars were coming, and they had already squirreled away the weapons other places throughout. One of them noted what the British found was they had four, I think it was 24 pounders or 3.24 pounders buried in a jail yard, which they found, which they had a hard time destroying because it's really hard to destroy, 5,000 pounds of iron. And you got to have special equipment and do what you have to do. Anyway, the British got there. And then, of course, as I said earlier, the militia all over Massachusetts had been ordered. That was their plan, was to go descend on Concord. So as the British are trying to destroy the weapons they found in Concord, militia are gathering all around them, and they're starting to realize that they need to get out of there. And then at the same time, which made worse, or kind of set the war off, was the British accidentally set fire to a meeting house when they were trying to burn some carriages that had for their artillery pieces. They set fire to this meeting house accidentally, and what that was, from the Americans' point of view, that was destroying property or hurting civilians, was the trigger that would move them from being just observers to participants in the fight. So that's when they decided to march down into Concord. Historians, the historical record is really kind of on those details, and I set it up a certain way. I'm sure every historian has a different way it's set up, but they didn't. The way I set it up in the novel was that the militia on the hill that overlooked Northbridge were really going down there to try to put out the fire. They were going to try to negotiate with the British. They were marching down two abreast, which all historians pretty much agree they're marching down two abreast, which is not a way to attack a force that's guarding a bridge. And when they get down there, the British soldiers fire on them, and the war starts. The Americans attack. The British there's three companies at the bridge. They were marching. They call the street fighting formation, which means the first company fires and is supposed to fall back behind the other two companies, and then the new lead company fires again, which is in a street fight. Then you're just raking down the street, and that would defeat them. But what happened was that when the first company pulled back, the other soldiers thought they were running, and they all took off because they were all afraid. They were afraid, and that started a panic among the British soldiers, and they ran off, and they had to be reorganized later in the battle. Um, and then, of course, the running fight back to the Boston starts.
Yeah, the militiamen take the bridge, and it sort of seems like they won the bridge and they're like, okay, now what do we do now? They didn't really expect to win this little skirmish here.
No, that's right. That's why I think that my assessment that they were not going down to fight the British, they were going down to try to talk to them or put out the fire, to show them that they're there. I don't think that they were actually planning on attacking them because they didn't know what to do. And then going back to the militia run, when the volleys fired, when the fighting started, there was supposedly 400 some militia on that bridge. Only about 50 of them actually made it to the other side of the bridge. And then another thing that's in the book or in the novel, which is not fictional, is that a British soldier was hit in the head with an axe, and one of the American soldiers tomahawked him and pulled off his skull cap. And when the British found the body later, they assumed that he had been scalped, and that caused all kinds of just angst and disagreement among the British soldiers that the Americans were scalping them.
Yeah, I want to talk about sort of the level of brutality, and I think that's a great segue into that. The British obviously think that these are savages who are scalping their troops. The British then kind of build up a lot of resentment towards the militia. They start burning homes that any militiamen are shooting from. What exactly is the level of brutality in this conflict?
So, right when they on the way to Concord, both they had been fairly nothing had really happened, and even when they were in Concord, the British were very correct; they weren't doing anything wrong. Um, uh, but once they thought they were being scalped, then the British started getting worried. And then the other part of this was they were when they started marching back, Americans militiamen were firing at them from every wall and every barn and building along the way. And even though there were individual battles where militia groups tried to stand up against the British soldiers, a lot of it was just individuals firing, and the British soldiers. And that is by modern rules of war, you're not supposed to do that. That is against the modern rules of war, and one of the reasons it's against the modern rules of war is because it provokes the soldiers to commit crimes that they're not supposed to. One of them is burn down people's houses and barns and stuff. And the British soldiers, though, there are I have not read, and if there is reports on that, I would be welcome to read them. But I have not read where the British soldiers like burned a family up in a family. They it appears that they tried to be honorable and chase the families out before they burnt the house. But their solution to this being shot at by was to burn chase the shooters away and burn the house down as punishment for shooting at the British soldiers without using the honors, without being part of a regular militia.
But this also sort of did kind of spiral out of control a little bit. There was a lot of looting, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and especially and started really badly in Monotony, which is modern day, I believe, Arlington, and they burnt. Yeah, the British kind of got out of control. It was house to house fighting. The British soldiers themselves got out of control, and as I said in the beginning of this, that the British soldiers were very not very well paid. And that they thought, well, I'm going to burn this house down. I might as well loot it first and take what I can get. And there was a lot of looting going on when the British. And then the other part of this is that the officers, British officers, also, of course, needed money, as I said, because they had to buy commissions. And so there was reports that British officers were encouraging the soldiers to loot. So that looting and burning kind of went hand in hand, and then really kind of lost control of the battle. Again, there's no indications that they were mistreating civilians. That they most of the people who were killed were militiamen, um, but and most of the houses they burned were associated in some way with you know what the British thought was unfair kinds of fights. But nonetheless, it got extremely brutal before they were even halfway back to Boston.
Yeah, it's crazy how this spiraled out of control. Did the British regulars achieve their goal? Because initially this was just a powder raid to destroy some munitions and guns that the militia had stored. Did they achieve that? Aside, they have the three guns buried. Did they even achieve their mission, or was this just?
No, absolutely not. They didn't come close. Most of I mentioned the Barrett House in the novel. The Barrett House they had I can't remember his first name, Barrett. Colonel Barrett had a bunch of weapons stored at his house. They literally ran the kids and stuff ran them out into the cornfields and hid them in the cornfields, and the British never found them when they got there. And they had known ahead of time that the British were coming, so most of the stuff was gone. So no, they did not achieve anywhere near their goals. Those guns were not destroyed. I don't know if they were used again, because they did try to do some destruction of the guns, but for the most part, it was a big fail. They didn't do anything but start the war, which is the opposite of what they wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly. This is complete utter failure. They didn't want to start the war. They wanted to destroy these guns, and they failed on all accounts.